students versus staff and volunteers. For Anna Leader, a Princeton Project 55 fellow at the organization, they are all winners.
I love working with the kids and I feel inspired every day.
Inspired because her job touches the lives of 60 students. She's one of about 4 dozen fellows participating in AlumniCorps' flagship program annually. 1 or 2 year fellowships offer skills that prepare for lives of leadership. Her organization, Capital Partners for Education, coaches low-income high schoolers aiming for college. Once they're enrolled, it helps them stay engaged. And when they graduate, they get career counseling.
Mentoring changes lives. It's about having exposure to things that they didn't necessarily know were possible. Mentors are able to help students develop skills that we wouldn't even think of needing to be developed, like communication and planning and goal setting.
Capital Partners for Education's mission is simple, says CEO Kari Brown.
If you were born into a poor family, it is statistically very, very likely that you are going to remain in poverty. We're trying to break those cycles, and we believe that education is the best vehicle, best path to help our students do that.
AlumniCorps got its start in 1989 when a group of Princetonians, spurred by their classmate Ralph Nader, had an ambitious vision to create a program that would inspire alumni, young and old, to work in the nonprofit world. In the 3 decades since, about 2,000 fellows have held paid positions in nearly 500 public interest organizations across the U.S. And for about 60%, the experience has launched a career in public service. Back at Capital Partners for Education, Brandon White is one of Anna Leader's bosses.
Nice.
And he mentors another Project 55 fellow at a different nonprofit, also affiliated with AlumniCorps.
When I was at Princeton, I thought I was going to go to Wall Street.
Chandler Cleveland's job is far more Main Street than Wall Street for the nonprofit Parents Amplifying Voices in Education.
I am going around holding a lot of meetings with parents. We actually work to challenge them to see, okay, what can you do to change the system? Really showing parents how powerful their voice is and how, if we work hard enough, we can see real positive change for our children here in D.C.
When he first landed in Washington, Cleveland needed help with some life and career basics, and White stepped up.
Our relationship just began as like a casual friendship.
Brandon and I, so we will, just go walking or running in the community.
But little by little, as we've been working together, he's been kind of trying to chart what his next career steps might be.
We've talked a lot about how to speak with my supervisor about wanting to do more.
When White needed a career boost of his own, he turned to another AlumniCorps program, Emerging Leaders. It was the brainchild of Hillary Joel, who wanted to offer former fellows, now mid-career workers, professional development. Candidates don't have to be Princetonians, and most are not.
We are advancing the next generation of social sector leaders and helping them be smarter and get there faster. We are focused on inside-out leadership development. So we are looking at self-awareness and self-management.
Brandon White benefited from the program, and so did his employer.
It was a terrific experience for him and very helpful as he was in his first real leadership position in a nonprofit organization. He's been a great asset to us.
AlumniCorps, 30 years young, mobilizes people of all ages and backgrounds to a life of public service.
The comprehensive approach to social change is what makes Princeton AlumniCorps special.
All of the different ways in which I've engaged with AlumniCorps have mutually reinforced one another.
What Princeton AlumniCorps really does is to help us understand better what does effective civic engagement look like.
What it looks like is a constellation of connections that makes real social change possible.
Hey there, everybody. Good evening and welcome. I'm Jean Trujillo, MAE Graduate School Class of '95, and along with Melissa Hager, we are co-chairs of the AlumniCorps New Jersey Area Committee. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Rick Ober and Tom Swift of the Princeton Area Alumni Association, Nancy Lynn and Doug Chin of the Asian American Alumni Association of Princeton, and Rob Wolk of the Princeton Association of New York City. I want to tell you a bit about AlumniCorps and why tonight's talk goes to the heart of AlumniCorps' call for civic engagement. Princeton Project 55, now known as Princeton AlumniCorps, began 30 years ago as a challenge from Ralph Nader, class of 55, to his classmates as they were turning 55 years old. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? Back then, 55 was the age when many companies allowed early retirements, and there was a feeling among his classmates they wanted something more. Nader and a committee of the class of 55 led the charge to create an alumni service organization that would mobilize their talents, experience, and energies to work on public interest and civic action projects toward solving systemic social problems. Over the last 30 years, there have been over 2,000 program alumni, 200 volunteers, and 600 partner organizations. This year, the New Jersey Area Committee supports 6 fellows working at nonprofits in New Jersey and Philadelphia. Additionally, there are about 50 fellows in the Bay Area, Boston, Chicago, New York City, and Washington, D.C. Each area committee supports the fellowship experience by organizing seminars on civic engagement and other topics of interest. Melissa and I chose tonight's topic because while everyone is keenly aware of the importance of the upcoming presidential election, less considered and perhaps even more important is the confluence of this year's state-level election outcomes, the census, and next year's redrawing of congressional district maps. What can we do to positively influence the public good and become more civically engaged? Before Melissa introduces Professor Wang, we have a quick poll to find out a little bit more about our audience. Let me start the poll here. And here we go. It says, since we're in webinar format and we cannot see each other, we thought it would be nice to get a sense of where we are located. Please choose the location that best fits where you are located this evening. And then if you scroll down a bit more, the question is, are you presently signed up or do you intend to work at the polls on election day this November in the capacity such as a poll worker, a party challenging official, or other election official, paid or unpaid? We'll give it a few more seconds. We have actually pretty good participation in the polling, higher than the presidential election. We are up to 82% of the attendees tonight voting. So I think I'm going to close it now. It doesn't look like it's been moving. And Melissa, I'll hand it over to you and share the results on screen. You're muted,
Melissa,
Melissa.
you're muted.
So thanks. It looks as if most of our participants are from the Northeast and that you can become, after tonight, more civically engaged Tigers. But I also want to point out that the attendees are from 19 different states and 5 different countries. So is a representation from literally around the world. Before I introduce Professor Wang, I'd like to remind you that this is webinar mode and that you can ask your questions through the chat below, the Q&A, and that Professor Wang will be answering questions, and we had the pre-sent questions which we'll be going through, and if he has time we'll go through any others. Also, I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. So again, I am Melissa Hager, and I am a co-area coordinator with Jean, as she mentioned, and it is such a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Wang, who is going to talk about his work on the gerrymandering project. Professor Wang grew up in California after emigrating to the United States from Taiwan. He received his undergraduate degree from the California Institute of Technology and received his PhD in neuroscience from Stanford University. Professor Wang came to Princeton in 2006, and he is a professor of molecular biology in neuroscience. He lives in Princeton with his family, including his 2 dogs. Now, among other areas, his current research addresses learning and plasticity in the brain, focusing on the cerebellum. He has published over 60 articles about brain functioning with a specific interest in autism. Professor Wang received numerous awards and is co-author of 2 books translated into over 15 languages. One is entitled, "Welcome to Your Brain, Why You Lose Your Car Keys But Never Forget How to Drive." The other bestseller is entitled, "Welcome to Your Child's Brain, How the Mind Develops from Conception to College." At the same time as being a well-respected and honored scientist in his field and for advances in his field, Professor Wang in 2004 was among the first to aggregate United States presidential polls using probabilistic methods. In 2008, he and Andrew Ferguson founded the Princeton Election Consortium blog, which analyzes US national polling data. Additionally, Professor Wang is faculty associate with Princeton's program in law and public affairs, and has published legal papers, op-eds, and journal articles on these topics. After the 2016 presidential election, Professor Wang wrote in a New York Times opinion piece, "As a scientist, I am committed to learning from my mistakes. Despite this year's failure, data is still our best resource for predicting events." So in 2017, he founded Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which uses an interdisciplinary approach to analyze data regarding gerrymandering in voting districts across the country. The project is working toward fixing bugs in our voting system. Professor Wang is here tonight to tell us about his work. It is with great pleasure, honor, and humility that Princeton AlumniCorps and our co-sponsors welcome Professor Wang to speak with us. Join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melissa, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Jean, for having me. And thanks to AlumniCorps and my good friend Rick Ober, who revealed to me the possibility of speaking to you all. And it was nice of him to invite me and nice of you all to have me. So let's see. So tonight, I see that most of you are from the Northeast, but of course there are some of you all over the country and indeed all over the planet. So what I'm going to try to do is capture for you some problems that we have right now in our democracy. And I would say that it's not an exaggeration to say that American democracy, which is one of the oldest democracies in the world, certainly the oldest constitutional democracy, is looking a little bit rickety right now. I think whether it be a popular vote loser becoming president and another, the second one in 20 years, whether it be difficulties with that unpopular president being unresponsive to the people, difficulties in the Senate, which is a strangely unrepresentative body, and finally, difficulties that I'll talk about with gerrymandering. All of these are symptoms of this strange time we're in, where we have this unique combination of close partisan division and economic tension and disruption, and a certain measure of public corruption. And all these things together have formed a pretty unique time. Although one thing I'm going to show you is that it's in fact not a completely unique time. It's what I would refer to as a second Gilded Age. So before I get into my main topic tonight, gerrymandering, I just want to show you a little bit of evidence about indicating how I think about our current time. So tonight we're going to talk about fixing bugs in democracy. And in particular, let's see, I just need to share the screen with you. Let me do that, share, and I do this. And in theory, this should work. Let me know if it doesn't work, but I believe it is now working. Let me just make the technological marvels of Zoom. So I assume that you can see my first slide now. And my topic tonight is fixing bugs in democracy with math, law, and technology. And what we're going to talk about tonight is all these problems in democracy and how I view them as a data scientist. Let's see, something's wrong here. Sorry, I actually have the wrong slide deck. That is just terrible. Let me try that again. So let's do that again. Let's close that up and let's share. Okay, so I hope you can see some shapes of New Jersey here. And so what I want to talk about tonight is a particular problem in democracy, which is that of gerrymandering. And I want to talk about ways in which our democracy is a little bit rickety, ways in which people are working to fix it, and in particular, things that you can do between now and November 3rd, including election day itself, to help make our democracy work a little bit better. And this is a project that we've been working on at Princeton. I've got a newish project called the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and it's grown. We now have a thing that we're just getting started on, the Electoral Innovation Lab, and I'm very excited to share with you some things that we've been working on. And what I'm hoping to get to is problems with gerrymandering nationwide, and then I'll mention in passing at the end a particular problem where there's a so-called reform on the ballot that in fact is probably not as good as it appears to be. And I'll talk to you about that ballot question, which you have some say over. So as you heard, my hobby is poll aggregation, and poll aggregation is basically just taking lots of data points, looking at individual polls and putting them together to come up with a more accurate statistical view of the picture. Now, polling got a bit of a black eye in 2016, which I think was a little bit undeserved. And if you are interested, while you are watching me, if you get tired of listening to me, you are free to go and look at a recent issue of the Columbia Journalism Review over at cjr.org, where I wrote an article called Our Polling Trauma, where we perhaps learned to be a little bit distrustful of data because state polls were off by about 3 points in 2016. And those 3 points in a super close election are, of course, quite consequential. It's my contention that polling is in fact fine, that small error was one that could be fixed, has been fixed, and in fact, perhaps unobserved by most of you, polling has done actually quite well in 2018 and 2019. And in particular, polls were very good in 2018 and 2019 at identifying close campaigns. So I want to emphasize to you that in fact, polling data is one of our best streams of information for understanding politics right now, and may end up being important as we head into an election where there's a uniquely strange phenomenon of a sitting president who is attempting to call into doubt the fairness and accuracy of the upcoming election. And so this is an interesting stress test to our democracy. Now, as I said, I've been doing polling aggregation since 2004. And if you're interested, I'm going to be talking about some things that are that you can find over at the Princeton Election Consortium, which is my public-facing site for analytics. And you can go to election.princeton.edu. And so if you go to election.princeton.edu, then you can see some of the things I'm going to talk about. And in particular, I'm going to end up talking about a feature that's called redistricting Moneyball. So let's see, let's try to get rid of that. There we go. All right, so do feel free to take a look at that and poke around while we're talking. Now, I said that we live in a unique time, but in fact, it's not quite unique. What I would characterize our time as is a gilded age, and it's not the first gilded age. The first gilded age came after the Civil War. It came right after a period called Reconstruction, and it was a time that was very difficult and often not thought about as part of American history. It's not a period of real national pride, and so in some sense, as American history goes, it's sort of flyover territory. And often historians will just tell you about the Civil War, and then they'll tell you about the Progressive era and World War I, and not bother talking about this period here. So 1876 to 1896, indicated here, was a period of racial division, technological disruption, increasing inequality, and deep, deep partisanship. Now, I hope that sounds familiar, because we are now living in a time where, in fact, we have, in our current time, racial divisions, technological disruption, strong inequality, and again, deep partisanship. As a data guy, I want to show you something else that is going on. This is a graph of the popular vote margin of the presidential winner. Now, we're mostly talking about something else tonight, redistricting and gerrymandering, but this is just to give you a sense of the bugginess of US democracy. This is the popular vote margin of the winner of the presidential election every year since John Quincy Adams' election got thrown into the House of Representatives. And you can see here that mostly American elections are not that close. The average from 1900 to 1996 was about a 15-point win for the winning candidate. Before, in the first century or so of the Republic, it was again about a 10% winning margin. But there are these two periods of really super close elections here, where where in 2 out of 6 elections, the popular vote loser became president, right? Rutherford Hayes and Benjamin Harrison. And then over here, if we look in more modern times, we have George W. Bush losing the popular vote, but defeating Al Gore for the presidency. And here, finally, Donald Trump, popular vote loser, but defeating Hillary Clinton through the mechanisms of the Electoral College. So the upshot here is that our American system usually leads the popular vote winner to become president, but not always. And there are these brief periods when elections are so close that sometimes it throws an error and basically elects somebody who did not get more votes. So this close division is an important component of what we're experiencing today. And it is a major bit of fuel for this unusual American achievement. Here's a survey of international scholars, political scientists, asking them how bad do you think gerrymandering is in different countries. This is a part of some survey data from the Election Integrity Project. And I think you can see here that the United States scores absolutely worst of any nation. We are in many ways an unusual country, but we're really number one when it comes to gerrymandering. It's an American achievement and one that is a strange bug in democracy. And now I'll tell you a little bit about how it came to be. So what's gerrymandering? It's a phenomenon that dates back to the early 1800s, to the earliest days of the Republic. And I found out about gerrymandering in 2012 when I, on my website, told people that it was likely that Democrats would win more votes for the House of Representatives, and I was right. And I said, therefore, it's likely that Democrats will, in fact, take control of the House of Representatives. Now that turned out not to be the case, and I found that to be pretty surprising. I thought they would retake control. My readers on my website said, no, Sam, you're missing out. Redistricting is so aggressive this time around that it's going to deviate from all historical patterns. And I said, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And it turned out that they were right and I was wrong. And so Republicans won control of the House by a 234 to 201 margin. And that was an unusual reversal. It's only the second time it's happened since World War II. And this is just an example of where the gerrymander gets its name. It's basically the aggressive drawing of districts. Over here on the right is not a dragon, but it's in fact a caricature of a salamander. This is an early political cartoon from 1812. And these are some counties in Massachusetts that were joined together in a peculiar way to give an advantage to one political party. And this was, at the time, made fun of. It was called a salamander. And the governor of Massachusetts who signed the plan was Elbridge Gerry. And so therefore it was called a gerrymander. And today we call it a gerrymander. And you can see here that this is a pretty strangely shaped district. And so the fundamental idea here is that when in the United States, we elected legislators who represent districts, but those same legislators draw those districts. And in the US, it happens every decade, right after a census, because there's a requirement that districts be of equal population. And so here we are living in a situation where legislators are elected under a set of districts and then get to draw their own districts. And so this self-dealing leads to a positive feedback loop, a positive feedback cycle, where the legislators are able to draw themselves an advantage. So in some sense, they choose the voters instead of the voters choosing the legislators. And this is, I would call it little d undemocratic, in the sense that representation can be completely distorted, that the majority party can end up getting fewer representatives, as happened in 2012. It's also little r, it violates little r republicanism, where those representatives are no longer answerable to the will of the voters because they don't have to worry. They live in safe districts where they don't have to worry about re-election. And so that combination of little d, anti-democracy, and little r, anti-republicanism, is really this major flaw in our democracy. Now, this is just a rogues gallery of some of these strange districts that have come to pass. Here is a district, and I should say that of these districts, the only district that faces water of all these districts is this. This is the North Shore. This is a Great Lake, and this is, I guess, Lake Erie, I suppose. And this is the north boundary of Ohio. But all the other boundaries here are in fact landlocked. And so every one of these squiggly boundaries was drawn by a human being or a committee to gain an advantage. And so, for instance, here, this is Michigan's 14th district, and in email that was recovered in correspondence in the drawing of that, the legislators said they were collecting Democratic garbage in this district and packing it all in one district. Here's one that's closer to most of you. It's in Pennsylvania. This is now a district that is called Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. And Goofy Kicking Donald Duck is a district in which, again, I believe in this case, Republicans were drawn to give them a very slight advantage so that they can win a very small victory and win lots of those little victories. And then this is a pretty windy district in Florida. And so gerrymandering has really reached new heights. Now, the news I'm going to tell you tonight is one of good news, which is that, in fact, there are ways to defeat gerrymandering. And there are things that you can do this November to defeat gerrymandering. And I just want to point out that there's actually been quite a lot of progress in the last decade where this one got redrawn. I believe this one got redrawn. This one got redrawn. This one got redrawn. And so really, we've made quite a lot of progress in undoing some of the most offensive shapes in congressional districts. And I think that that progress can really continue if we put our backs into it. So it's not just about funny shapes, it's also about the way people arrange themselves. And this is just to show you how much of a difference it can make. On the left, imagine two parties where one party is represented by green and the other is represented by purple. With the same population pattern, which is on the left and on the right, it's possible to draw boundaries on the left, which shows five districts for the green colored party and one district for the purple colored party. And Helen, I will take questions afterwards. I'm not going to be able to take your question now, I'm sorry. Unless it's really urgent, I would prefer to wait till the end, if that's okay. And then on the right, we can also draw pie slices. And let's see, let me just, on the right, we have pie slices, and we can get now 4 districts for the purple party and 2 districts for the green colored party. So you can see whoever draws the lines, in fact, has quite a lot of power, more power than the voters, incredibly. And this power and competitiveness can really be driven by line drawing. Here's a famous case where in state court, there was actually a redrawing of the map because the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court said that the map was unfair and had to be redrawn. And they asked the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, to propose remedial maps. And the blue boundaries here are the boundaries of the proposed map. On the left is a map proposed by Pennsylvania legislative Republicans in the legislature. And what you can see here is that these blue lines don't look so offensive in their shape compared with some of the shapes I showed you before. They're not so bad. But you can also see here that cities got split. You can see here that right here, Harrisburg got split. Over here, there's a split in the Wilkes-Barre region. Over here, there's some splits going on. This is a split here now in Reading. And so these splits created a situation in which a 50-50 statewide vote would produce 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. And none of those races would be close. On the other hand, the court said, well, we're not going to take anybody's suggestion. We're just going to hire a special master to draw a map, and we're going to have that person do it. And the special master ended up drawing a map that ended up electing 9 Republicans, 9 Democrats, and furthermore, had 6 close races. And so what this goes to show is that shape is not enough. Far more than shape goes into it. You need to know about the people who live there, and you need to know something about the neighborhoods and communities. And it is possible to draw a map that treats the 2 major political parties equitably if you know what you're doing. And so really, the technology of redistricting has gotten better and better, where we can do all these things by computer in ways that were just undreamt of 20 years ago. The number of gerrymanders has gone up dramatically in the last 20 years. This is now the number of gerrymanders per decade. It used to be that one extreme partisan gerrymander happened per decade, more or less. In the 1980s, there was a particularly famous one that Democrats committed under political boss Phil Burton. But starting in 2000, the number of partisan gerrymanders went way up. And the reason has to do with several of the things I've talked about. One is partisan polarization. Another is the technology. And finally, another is the fact that in 2010, there was a national wave election in which many state governments came under single party control. And it became possible for a political party, in this case, the Republicans, to draw more than half a dozen extreme gerrymanders nationwide. So you can see that this distortion of representation has gotten worse and worse over time and has reached crisis proportions in the US. Now, the Supreme Court declined to step in to prevent gerrymandering, and the question is, well, who can do it? And the answer is federalism, and the answer is states' rights. Now, if you studied history in school, you may have heard of states' rights as being a bad thing, a way of propagating racism, a way of holding back civil rights. But in fact, states' rights can also be used to move reform forward, whether it be passing a citizen initiative, whether it be pursuing justice in state courts, whether it be public input, passing laws. There are ways to, in fact, get reform to happen state by state, even if the Supreme Court is unwilling to step in. Now, at my team, at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which you can go to, but you can look it up at gerrymander.princeton.edu over here in the lower right, we've looked into it and we've figured out that there are different kinds of reforms that can be undertaken in every single state. So in some states like California and Colorado and Michigan, there are independent commissions that were voted on by the citizens of that state. And so they have commissions that take the power entirely out of the hands of politicians. That's a really good solution. There are other advisory commissions such as Iowa, Missouri, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Those advisory commissions can also and some of them are semi-independent, some of them still have legislators. But that's another way to achieve reform. Now, there are a few things that are happening on the ballot this November. I'm just going to mention them now, and we'll come back to them, I hope, during discussion. One way to do it is through a ballot initiative by amending the Constitution. Here in Virginia, there's going to be a ballot initiative in which people can vote on an initiative to take some of the power away from legislators and create a bipartisan process. And so that's one way in which there can be reform this November for people who live in Virginia. There was such a reform in Missouri in 2018, taking some of the power away from legislators and putting it into the hands of a nonpartisan demographer. In November, there's actually an anti-reform where there's a ballot initiative which undoes that reform and puts the power back in the hands of legislators. And so this November, there's an initiative that is in fact bad for redistricting, which is on the ballot in Missouri. And I'll come to it later. There's a ballot initiative here in New Jersey where there's also an initiative that seems like it helps a disorderly census, but actually makes things a bit worse. And I'll be glad to talk about that during question and answer. Now, it turns out that one of the local routes that you can take to redistricting is something that doesn't involve reform, doesn't involve persuading legislators to give away their power. It involves brute political force. And what I mean by brute political force is the idea that in some states, what you can do is force the process to become bipartisan, take away power from the majority party, and force a situation where both parties have to come to the table. This doesn't solve all problems. It still creates a problem for still leaves the possibility of racial gerrymandering, which is a whole topic in itself. But this November, it is possible to get out the vote in very selected regions in the following states, and by so doing, gain bipartisan government. And that includes Texas, it includes Florida, it includes North Carolina. So these are all states that are pretty close for the presidency. But it also includes some states because of quirks in how they do their redistricting. It includes other states where in fact, one party's in the majority and yet will have to share power depending on what the voters do. So Democrats may have single party control in Connecticut, but in fact, if enough people turn out, that can become a bipartisan process. In Kansas, there's single party control over redistricting in the form of the Republican Party, but in fact, flipping just one legislative seat can change that. And finally, Minnesota, where again, Democrats in this case are in charge. So there's all these ways in which fairness can be attained, and all these places I've just checked off amount to almost 1/4 of all congressional districts in the United States. And so that means that it's in your power and the power of your communities. About 1/4 of you on average, wherever you live, are likely to have some way of bringing about fairer districting. Okay, so I just want to very briefly mention an initiative that's on the ballot here in New Jersey. It's an initiative that's a constitutional amendment to change the legislative redistricting schedule if census data is delayed, right? Public question number 3. And it's got this long, long interpretive statement, which is like, frankly, just too much to read. This is a photograph of my mail-in ballot. Everybody in New Jersey got a mail-in ballot. I accidentally got 2, but unlike the President of the United States, I'm just going to vote once. One person, one vote, that's the rule. And so it turns out that this is basically an amendment that says if the census is delayed, which we know it's going to be, then redistricting is going to be delayed. So that sounds like it might be a pretty good idea because we are delayed in the census. But it says if the census data comes later than February 15th, which is very early. The law doesn't require data to be delivered until April 1st, so it's even earlier than the federal deadline for delivering data. It furthermore says that it's not just for next year when we're going to be still in the middle of a pandemic, but in fact, all future decades. And so the reason that we believe that this is a problem is there's been pretty big demographic change in New Jersey. And this gives a sense for why we care about redistricting so much. This is now a map of increases in population in the Hispanic and Latino population, that's on the left, and then Asian population changes, that's on the right. And you can see here that there have been some pretty large changes. In fact, there are 400,000 more Latino and Asian people in New Jersey than there were 10 years ago, based on the American Community Survey. And so based on that, that's about as many people as 2 whole state assembly districts. And what that means is that they're in some sense not very well represented, because these lines have to be drawn to respect not only equal population, but also respect the communities that people live in, and to give ethnic minorities a chance to elect members to their liking. And these are that's required by the Voting Rights Act. And so this initiative would basically delay this redistricting by 2 years and leave these demographic changes unrepresented. And it would do it by setting a weirdly early deadline. So as far as we can tell, this is legislation that's not really needed. But I just wanted to mention that because, you know, there's reform breaking out all over the country, but sometimes it's not really real reform. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is something that all of you can do wherever you are in the country to help bring about fair districting anywhere. So I've talked about how a single party can deal itself into power. Well, elections matter. They especially matter if bipartisan control of redistricting process is possible but not guaranteed. I've mentioned some states that have an independent redistricting commission: Arizona, California, Michigan. They're fine. They don't need our help. There are states where there's single party control of government and there's no way of breaking it. Arkansas and Illinois, those are examples of that. There's no action item. There's lots of stuff for you to vote for locally in those states, but bipartisan redistricting is not one of them. So the third category that's really important is the category where split government is possible, where it might be possible to gain split control of government, and that includes a number of states which I've mentioned already. So what we've done is we've taken our combined expertise in math, political handicapping, and an exhaustive reading of all the laws of the 50 states. And what we've done is we've figured out places where it's possible to attain bipartisan control of government, and it's these 6 states I mentioned before: Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Minnesota, Kansas, Connecticut. These are the 6 states where there's a possibility of bipartisan control. And how do you get bipartisan control? Well, the answer is you go to the districts that are really super close, that are very competitive, and you make sure that state legislators get elected of the minority party. And if you can do that, then you can force the issue and bring about bipartisanship that politicians themselves are not necessarily inclined to do. So we did the math. I'm going to try to be brief about this, but we basically figured out about how much a state legislative district win probability would be altered by shifting just a few votes from one column to the other. And so he said, okay, imagine if you give in this case, the Republicans just a few votes. If you just give the Republicans just a few more votes, then the win probability for the Democratic candidate goes down a little bit. And so the voter power of those few votes is 0.02. Now, what we did was we figured that out for state districts, legislative districts all over the country, and we figured out the power of individual votes. And to just give you a sense of it, if you live in a district with just a few people in it, your power is quite great. If you live in a district with lots of people, you don't have as much power. And so your vote matters more if you live in a small population district. Your vote matters more if fewer people turn out. Your vote matters more if state bipartisan control hinges on how your district turns out. And finally, your vote has a big impact if there is a large number of potentially gerrymandered states at stake in the entire state. So we figured this out. And if you go to the website, I assume that some of you have a web browser open. If you go to election.princeton.edu and you click the word legislative in the banner, or you click the redistricting Moneyball text in the right-hand sidebar, you can get this map. And you go to election.princeton.edu, and there's this feature called redistricting Moneyball. And what we were able to figure out is we were able to figure out where there were concentrations of voter power, high voter power in the United States. And just to give you some examples, there's a huge concentration of political power in the hands of voters in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Dallas County, Tarrant County, Collin County, and Denton County. these 4 counties here, voters have a lot of power because there's something like 10 close legislative districts, and it only takes flipping 9 legislative districts to bring the Texas House under Democratic control, and therefore force a bipartisan situation where the governor, who's a Republican, has to work with Democrats in order to draw a map that satisfies both parties. Here, there's another cluster. This is an interesting case because this is Johnson County, which is just south of Kansas City. And Johnson County is a place where there are some swing districts because, like suburbs all over America, suburbs are trending Democratic. And in this case, just flipping 1 state legislative seat would be enough to break the supermajority and again force bipartisanship. In this case, a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. So these stories are repeated all over the country, and you can make a difference by, if you live in these places, you can get out the vote, you can send postcards, you can in fact give donations. Actually, I have a donation sidebar set up at election.princeton.edu. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I've set a mechanism up for you to help attain fairness. It's one of the very few websites on the internet. I've never seen another one that has donations sidebars that can help you donate to either Democrats or Republicans. And so depending on where you want to achieve fairness, you have opportunities to do so between now and November. So I really encourage this. It sets the political playing field of power for the next decade. So I just want to close and open up for questions. I feel like I've spoken too long and I really want to get into a real discussion here. I want to close with the words of a president from a century ago, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. After he left office, he started speaking his mind more freely. And I want to describe some ideals that he spoke of that I think are important for us to keep in mind for having a truly representative democracy that serves us well as a republic. Roosevelt said, "The national government belongs to the whole American people." He said, "Our whole experiment is meaningless unless we're to make this a democracy in the fullest sense of the word. If the minority is as powerful as the majority, there is no use of having political contests at all, for there's no use in having a majority." So what I would say is that Roosevelt had some pretty useful words for us. He described an ideal of government in which implicitly everyone votes, and in which there is fair representation for as many people as possible, including the majority. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd be delighted to take some questions and have some discussion. Thanks.
Again, thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful overview for all of us. Now we'll start with some questions.
Sure. So one of the questions that was pre-submitted kind of goes back to what you'd said earlier, Sam, about the racial minorities that are growing faster in New Jersey. So the question is it possible to create a computer program that could redistrict in a truly representative and objective manner? And how do efforts to ensure minority representation complicate matters?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think people who come into this reform space have come in with really idealistic ideas, thoughts about how to achieve reform. One category of idea is let a computer do it. Another category is draw the shapes to be as compact and as unsquiggly as possible. And I will say that those are common ideas, but I'm going to just say flat out that those are wrong ideas. And let me explain this to you. So there are uses for automated drawing of districts, and I think it's an important concept. But the way I would put it is this. The current generation of automation allows districts to be drawn as compactly as possible, but often does not take into account these other things, where people live. For example, one of the districts I showed you in Chicago was a peculiar district because it had, it was sort of shaped like a pair of sideways earmuffs. It had like a thing like this and then a thing like this. And that district turned out to be drawn because there was a requirement in the Voting Rights Act to take Spanish-speaking communities and give them an opportunity to elect somebody to their liking. And so the best way to do that was to join these two neighborhoods that were pretty far apart from one another. So one difficulty that comes up in automated districting is to make sure that these communities get taken into account. So you could do that, but you would then have to have an algorithm that took into account population, fairness between the parties, and communities. And I think it's possible to do such a thing, but no one's done that yet because people have been focused on simple things like shape. And not to be too blasé about it, but I would say automated redistricting is sort of a, I would say it's sort of a white person solution in the sense that people in the ethnic majority often don't think first about the complications of being in a minority group. And so given the Voting Rights Act, which requires some of these other considerations to come into play, I think it's tough to have an algorithm do it. Not impossible. One can imagine an algorithm doing it. And Jean, there was another part of the question that I feel that I have not answered here. What was the other part of the question?
So I think it was just about the minority representation.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, look, the difficulty is that I would say that there is something that automation can do. And I think here's a domain where the suggestion from the audience member is quite useful. One can use automated methods to draw millions of possible plans. And even though they may not be great plans because they split a community, or they may annoy somebody, or they may not reflect the entire consensus of people in that state, they give a sense of all the possibilities. And so computer algorithms are potentially quite good at determining whether a plan is an outlier, in the sense that if there's a bell-shaped curve of possibilities, if the map that's actually passed into law is all the way at the end of the distribution, then that's something that automated approaches are quite good at detecting. And so automated approaches have found use in courts of law as a way to detect outliers.
So I just have a follow-up question then on that. So is that where the census data comes in, where they ask what your race, your ethnicity is?
Yeah, there's all kinds of reasons why that gets used, but that's where that's necessary from a civil rights and resource allocation standpoint. But one of the things that happens is that under the Voting Rights Act, certain racial groups that have been historically discriminated against have a special category, fall under a special category in the Voting Rights Act, and specifically they're Blacks and Hispanics. And so those are communities that deserve some consideration, where they ought to have at least the opportunity to elect members who reflect their interests. Not necessarily a member of their race, but just somebody who they find of interest. So for instance, if a district is winnable by a Democrat and is 37 to 49% African American, then that's enough African Americans where it is possible for them to elect a representative of their choice. I mean, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, but that's an example. Yeah, so the requirements for districting are, districts have to be of equal population, and they have to obey the Voting Rights Act. That's it. Those are the main requirements. There are no requirements of shape. There's some requirement for compactness, but there's so many different definitions of compactness that effectively there is no definition of compactness.
Then I have another question, sorry, to follow up. Then in terms of the redistricting, when we see some more heavily packed, like say Republicans versus Democrats, how do they figure that out? Are they just I mean, how are they making that assumption?
Let me get into that a little bit. I see in the chat there's a question. I'm going to pull up the chat just so I can see it fly by. Somebody mentioned something about the Supreme Court, which is that the Voting Rights Act has been partially invalidated. It turns out that I believe Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has been invalidated by the Shelby County decision. Section 5 still stands. One of the things that's really urgent right now in terms of a civil rights agenda or voting rights agenda is to take the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its amendments and to update it for current times, because Chief Justice John Roberts struck down part of the Voting Rights Act because he said that it no longer reflected the fact, I think he claimed that basically racial problems in southern states were over and that it was unfair to differentially regulate southern states and not other states. And so one can easily imagine the protections of the Voting Rights Act applied to all the states equally, and then that would be perhaps a fix. So yeah, the Voting Rights Act is a live topic. It's going to come up. It came up in this Congress in a thing called HR 4. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about that. But basically, these things that I've talked about are a moving target, and with federal courts moving to the right, it's going to continue to be a moving target, which means that it probably needs active engagement from citizens, Congress, and state legislatures to fix these things. And I'm seeing a lot of chat on the right sidebar, and without getting into any of that, any of those details, I think I mostly agree with the things that are being said in the chat.
So there's another question about what can we do as citizens within the next 45 days to ensure fair redistricting? And does it go beyond just the voting booth? Should we be writing our legislators and senators?
This is really not the time to be writing your legislator or senator. That is, like, I would say, there is an exception which I will come to, but it's not really the time for getting in contact with your legislator. So firstly, I'm going to emphasize it some more, and I apologize for being a little bit of a broken record about this, but really I think the number one thing you can do is to, here's our redistricting Moneyball feature. Really the number one thing you can do is to, if you can, help in places where there are swing districts. Like here in Harris County, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there's 8 swing districts here where one can in fact help to bring about change by basically supporting candidates who would bring about bipartisan government. So that's a way to do it. There is a thing you can do. So I would say, like, the number one thing you can do is really work in any of these states, whether it be Texas, Minnesota, Kansas, Florida, right? Connecticut, and North Carolina. So really that's the number one thing you can do. And I encourage you to look over these states. There's another thing you can do, which is that there are some places where it's not that likely that single party control of redistricting will be broken. So I'll give you an example. In Minnesota, there is a possibility that Democrats will gain single party control. And single party control of redistricting would open up the possibility for Democrats to commit a gerrymander. And what you can do there in the face of that is to get in touch with legislative candidates, and just extract from them a promise, a commitment to use neutral principles of districting to draw a map, to seek external auditing, to score maps through a third party. And so I think one thing you can do is you can talk to candidates on the campaign trail and extract that promise from them. An example of that, and there's another, there's stuff that can be done, for instance, in Virginia, even though in Virginia it's a ballot initiative, not legislative elections. There's a ballot initiative that opens up the possibility of citizens getting involved in the process. And there, that reform is really important for the future of Virginia, I think, and really takes away some power away from legislators. And furthermore, there's what's called, this gets into the weeds, but you can go to our website, gerrymander.princeton.edu, and there's something called enabling legislation. And this enabling legislation really puts some teeth into that constitutional amendment. And so you can contact your legislator and argue for that. I think really the thing that people can really do in regard to contacting legislators is get in touch after the election is over, and then start getting involved in the redistricting process, because all of next year is redistricting time. I'll give you an example. There's some students here at Princeton who have created a software tool to help citizens give input. And I'm going to drop it in the chat. It's called representable.org. If you go to representable.org, this is a software tool to help citizens weigh in with redistrictors and contribute shapes of their communities and say, this is where we live, this is who we are. And so my students have created this tool, and we're looking to put this tool into the hands of redistrictors and commissions nationwide. So I think there is stuff to do, a lot of stuff to do next year, but between now and November, it's mostly voting.
There's actually a follow-up question in the Q&A. When you said earlier, voting for the minority party,
which question is it?
It's in the Q&A, it's the very first one.
Oh,
voting for the minority party seems a risky procedure if you disagree with that party's other legislative priorities. So I just thought that was because you said when you went to the Moneyball site.
Yeah, what's
your opinion on that?
I get it. You don't want to vote for the enemy. I got it. This is polarization in America today. Look, I came up with half a dozen possibilities, and 2 of them are places to go on the offensive if you're a Republican, 4 on the offensive if you're a Democrat. So that's my first answer. My second answer is in about half of states, there is a process for amending the Constitution through citizen initiative. And that process can be very effective. This year, there were difficulties in several states because there were court challenges, and a number of those initiative processes failed through a combination of court challenge and pandemic. And so, for instance, Arkansas was a place where it failed. Oregon was a place where it failed. And so in about half of states, it would be possible to get justice through citizen initiative. Now, looking at the second half of Pete's question, what's our incentive for disarming in order to give that minority power? Oh, Pete, I don't know what to tell you. I do know what to tell you, which is as follows. I'll be very specific about this. The bigger offenders in partisan gerrymandering in the last 10 years have been Republicans, and they have gained representation beyond their proportion of votes through gerrymandering. You might think that if you were a Democrat, that you should therefore do the same to them. There are some problems with that. The first problem is that the way that Democrats and Republicans live, it's actually pretty hard to gain a similar advantage if you're a Democrat, because Democrats are like 80% Democrats in urban areas, and Republicans are more like 60% Republican in rural areas, or maybe 70% Republican. And so there's this slight asymmetry, which makes it tougher for Democrats to draw an advantageous map. The other thing is that Democratic Party politics are coalitional. And so Democrats have all kinds of forces where they might want to draw a single district gerrymander to make one person safe. And so it's actually, there are forces that make it really tough for Democrats to stick to their internal party principles and at the same time stick it to the Republicans. And so I'm just giving you the cynical argument. There's not very much to be gained by attempting to gerrymander if you're on the Democratic side. And so if there's not very much to be gained and you can do the right thing, do the right thing. Anyway, that's my thought about it. And then and the other part is like, he goes on about Roe versus Wade. I think that people underestimate the importance of fair representation. I'm just going to say here that it sounds obscure, but when one party can get 49% of the vote and get 10 out of 13 members of the legislative delegation, that's actually more important. So I would really encourage you to step back and think about what's going to serve all your ideals for the next 10 years. And so I appreciate the importance of all these issues that people care about in the chat. But redistricting is a topic that sounds technical, and then you discover how important it is when you don't get represented. Flint doesn't have clean drinking water because of gerrymandering. Governor Whitmer's mass directive in Michigan was struck down because of gerrymandering, because the legislature was unanswerable to the people. And so I really have to emphasize that I chose this topic not because I love math, but because it's a major deficiency in our democracy, and it actually comes before all the other problems. Anyway, I'll stop.
No, that's a great answer. And then actually it reminds me of a question that when we were preparing for this talk that I don't think you covered. You started in neuroscience and you talked about your hobby as polling. How
Yes.
did you make that, like, can you just kind of share a little bit more about that? I just
Sure.
find that fascinating.
Well, Jean, my background's in physics, and physics is a discipline where you really have to reduce data and take a lot of observations and reduce them to simple measures that capture some underlying law. And that's just a thing you get trained in when you're an undergraduate. And in neuroscience, my research often consists of data reduction, where I have to constantly take noisy, cruddy measurements and turn them into something orderly. And so in the news, we are constantly beset by these things like, Biden is up by 11 points in Florida. No, Biden's up by 1 point in Florida. Trump is up by 3 points in Alaska. No, Trump is up by 15 points in Alaska. Actually, Biden's ahead. So individual data points are just incredibly annoying. And my initial interest in politics was to try to take all that information and reduce it to simple measures. And I had two goals. One was to give a simpler measure that created more oxygen in the room for people to talk about issues. And another, which was to help people identify how they could deploy their own efforts most efficiently, how citizens can optimize their efforts. Because there are forces in this nation of great wealth that have plenty of expertise that tell them exactly where to give their money. And I thought that it'd be helpful to make those same tools available to every person. And so this is why I created election.princeton.edu. And since then it's grown. As I've learned more about law and thought more about where our democracy is headed, I've gotten more and more interested in using those tools to help make, to basically build democracy 2.0.
pretty cool. Melissa, I'm going to swap the order of questions just for a minute because
I was going to follow up to this question with about the polls.
Yes.
And do you think that the polls this time around in this presidential election are going to be more precise than they were in the last election?
Probably, but even if they're not, the error last time was only 3 points, and 3 points is kind of a biggish error. But in fact, let me just show you something here. I'll go back to sharing my screen. Hold on for a second.
I also have a question about polling. And while you're looking, when polls are conducted, are they actually conducted across the board to hit the populations that we're talking about, minority populations?
Absolutely. Pollsters, okay, first off, pollsters are not Nimrods. Pollsters are actually thinking about these things all the time. They get professional training in these things. And so they think all the time about how to reach hard to reach demographic groups. In certain cases, it is hard for them to reach a demographic, usually having to do with the fact that in certain states, a lot of people move into or out of the state in any given year. And so, for example, Alaska and Nevada are pretty hard states to poll. But generally speaking, they think pretty hard about it. To the extent that there was a mistake in 2016, there was a possibility of undersampling white voters who didn't go to college. And look, these people have been working on that. One
Is there fear? Is there fear in part of some populations to respond to polls?
Not that I'm aware of. Let me just finish. I actually haven't finished answering the question. To put it another way, there was a polling error in 2016, but polls were pretty much on the nose in 2018 and 2019. And earlier on, when I showed my article from the Columbia Journalism Review, I circled a paragraph, and the paragraph was about how well polls did in 2018 and 2019. So first of all, empirically, polls do pretty well. Secondly, let's suppose hypothetically that polls are off by as much as they were in 2016. So right now in my screen share, this is where I'm pointing at is the electoral map if the polls are approximately accurate now. And if we assume a 3-point error favoring Donald Trump, which is the error that we had in 2016, this is what the map looks like. And you can see here that that 3-point error makes North Carolina and Georgia toss-ups too close to call, but it still has an overall map. Now let me just back up and say that I think that this question is fundamentally kind of this is like when you have a traumatic experience, you're scared of the thing that did a bad thing to you. But in this game, I would really encourage people to think ahead to the next problem. It's like Wayne Gretzky said about, like they used to say about Wayne Gretzky, he went where the puck was going to be. And I think it's important for Americans to go where the puck is going to be. And where the puck is going to be this year is lawsuits to stop the orderly count of votes across the country. It's purposeful slowing of the mails, or maybe inadvertent slowing of the mails. It is voting under pandemic conditions. I saw that in the survey, only 11 of you said that you were going to be poll watchers or helping out with voting. I gotta say, guys, you gotta pick up the slack here. There is a real need to help your democracy. You, like ordinary people of ordinary decency, have to do way more than the ordinary amount to make sure that we get this basic decency of having a good election. I think the vast majority of Americans want a good election that's fair and complete and lets people vote without fear of disease or having their vote not count. And I think that this is like, go where the problem is going to be. And I'll tell you where the problem is going to be, which is that North Carolina and Florida are not only swing states, but if they come out ambiguously on election night, there's 15 states around the country that cannot start counting mail-in votes until election day. And if you can't start counting votes until election day, under current conditions, that's going to be weeks before we get it worked out. And I think what that does is it creates, I think, pressure on us as citizens to do whatever we can to make elections go as orderly as possible, in orderly a fashion as possible. And I'm just going to scare you by saying, here's some states that count their votes starting on election day: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Do these ring a bell? You know, these are states where we better watch out. And I think that there is plenty to do. And I know this is a lot of like real boring citizenship stuff that we do. But I hope that more than 11 of you end up helping out, because I got to say there is plenty to do on election day. Anyway, sorry to go off about it, but I
No,
just think
that's great.
the next problem is that's the next problem.
That actually goes back to what Ralph Nader once said, is that there can be no daily democracy without daily citizenship. I wanted to go to a question in the chat, in the Q&A, that actually touches on what you had.
Yep.
Those of us who are on the chat are very, but how do you get the general population to be interested in making change? Like, how can we get the message out that to people who are more concerned about day-to-day issues, that they just, you know, they can't be bothered with this? How do we make that important to them?
Yeah, disengagement with politics is a pretty major problem of our time. I think that there are, for some reason, I'm thinking of a book by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where we are so interested in our devices and our televisions and our email and our social media. I think it's really hard to be engaged. I think one major answer is to look locally. If you look on the right sidebar of my website, election.princeton.edu, I have a guide that describes things that matter in every one of the 50 states. I think that one thing that really comes up, and I think that you know, one whole demographic that's done really well at engaging with politics at a local level is Republicans. Conservatives and Republicans have a tendency to be very focused on their immediate community and their immediate neighbors. And this is a real strength of the Republican Party. And I would say that everyone in the United States should learn from that and think about what's important near you. So for example, I'm interested in some close congressional districts near me. There's this woman, Amy Kennedy, running against Jeff Van Drew in the South. There's this redistricting initiative that I showed you a picture of. This is my ballot. Yeah, I got to vote now. I'll vote later, but I got to vote no on this thing. And so, you know, you gotta, I think this breaks the federal law, but anyway, but like you gotta anyway, but you gotta vote on things that matter to you, right? Like I care a lot about these things because they're in a community. Now it's easier to have things that you care about when you've lived in a community a long time. And so there are challenges to really developing this affinity for your immediate neighbors. But I would say the principle of federalism, which is that power emanates from the governments at all levels, federal, state, city, local. I've lived in Princeton for a while, and so I have opinions about the school board. And I'm like, okay, I'll vote for her, but I'm not going to vote for him. So I think that really we need to start tending our fences and really strengthening democracy by thinking about things at a local level. So I think that's one way of doing it.
But then I have a follow-up question, because one of the pre-submitted questions asked, is there an impact on local school boards, public school education from gerrymandering, like through the funding? Sometimes.
So for example, there's a pretty famous, famous to legal scholars. It's like the Gore Vidal joke. He is famous to the few who know him. But anyway, there's a famous gerrymandering case, Wake County, which is the county that Raleigh, North Carolina is in, where districts got gerrymandered. And so there are counties where the legislature, where like in Nassau County, which is kind of the western bit of Long Island that's closest to Queens, that legislature appears to be gerrymandered. School districts can be gerrymandered, so you just carve off the communities that have more money so that your kids have the benefit of more money. You take all those other kids who you don't care about so much. So yeah, I mean, in cases where school districts can be drawn, there is very much the possibility of gerrymandering. Often there is prejudice gets built into the highways. There's a famous article by a historian about why it takes 4 hours to get through Atlanta traffic. I believe my colleague Kevin Cruz wrote about it, where it takes 4 hours to get from one end of Atlanta to the other because prejudice and the building of highways and all these other things like built a form of physical gerrymandering into the landscape. And so all these things, sometimes gerrymandering gets done with like poured concrete. Sometimes it gets done with a politician who draws a line with a pen. Doesn't always affect school districts, but it is everywhere. And it is this weird technical activity that affects maybe how much money your kids get for their school.
So following up to that, in the chat, there are two questions. One of the questions asked about, what do you think about required voting? And then another one, which would affect gerrymandering, is there were the two countries on your slide that had like no issues with gerrymandering. Would taking their models work here in the United States?
Okay, so there are different ways to get rid of at least representational gerrymandering. One is the Knesset of Israel. The Knesset has 120 members, and it is done almost entirely by proportional representation. If you get above a certain threshold, then you get representation. Now, I should point out that the Knesset, if you follow Israeli politics, is not really a model of getting along and legislative productivity. One might have some questions about that. The other problem in Israel, less of a problem because it's a small country, is that the members of the legislature, of the Knesset, don't have constituents who they answer to directly. And so that's another difficult problem. There are hybrid systems where this is solved. Mexico and Germany have hybrid systems. Germany has a system where people run in districts, and then somebody adds up all the votes nationwide and says, well, if a party is underrepresented in the legislature, then they add at-large members to make up the difference. And so you can imagine a reform like that. I will say that I tend to be conservative in the personal sense, where what I like is fixes that I think are attainable in our system of government in the next 10 years. And so even though theoretically there is some advantage to adopting a German or Mexican system, I chose to work on these problems because I want to see bug fixes for democracy where we can work with the things that we have available and try to get something fair between now and, say, when my kid grows up. And the changing to proportional representation, I think, kind of sounds appealing, but that would require either a constitutional amendment or a constitutional convention. And given current conditions in the United States, I actually don't want a constitutional convention because I see that as a destabilizing event. So I think that one should, I certainly see the reason for wanting these things. And I think they're important ideals to think about because it gives you an ideal to work towards. And then to my thinking, the next step is, okay, that's the perfect. Now, can we get something good? And if we can get something good in a few years, then let's go for that.
And what about requiring the population to vote, having a requirement somehow?
Like in Australia, where you have to pay a fine if you don't vote. That would be great. In the United States, there is a powerful tradition of wanting to be left alone. And I think the difficulty in the United States is that we have to use basically carrots and not sticks, because we are very carrot-oriented people. Actually, in the United States, we're really carrot cake-oriented people. But anyway, and so I would say that probably we need to do things like make voting matter more, find reforms that, in the next 10 years, there's all kinds of reforms. Ranked choice voting is a reform. Gerrymandering reform is a reform. Reforming the judiciary. There are ways to make our democracy more responsive, and I think that's probably the way to do it. It would be nice to, I mean, I would love it if we gave people a little reward if they voted, but then that's tantamount to paying them to vote, and that's considered like borderline, wrong. Yeah.
You mentioned ranked choice voting. So are you in favor of that? So is that the same as preferential voting? And do you think it would change the politics in the country? And how?
So answering this requires getting into the weeds a teeny tiny bit. There's all kinds of voting reforms that address different kinds of problems. Ranked choice voting, I don't know if it's the same as preferential voting, but ranked choice voting is one where you give your first choice, second choice, third, and so on. It allows the possibility of expressing a preference for a minor party candidate without throwing your vote away, where you say, my first choice is so-and-so, my second choice is Sarah Gideon, my third choice is Susan Collins. I mean, that's the main Senate race. And so it solves that problem. It creates other problems. It's more work to vote if you are in the booth and you have to fill out your first, second, and third choice. And so that's difficult. But it can fix some problems. The reason I'm going to get into the weeds now is that these different rules for voting each have their own advantages and their own problems. And one needs to understand the politics of a state, the demography of a state. Like ranked choice voting is the law in Maine. That's actually a pretty good place for it because Maine has a pretty engaged political culture with pretty independent-minded voters. And so it's a good place for third-party candidates to thrive. It's also a place where you can have weird spoiler effects where somebody gets 40% of the vote, somebody else shows up and gets 20% of the vote, and then messes it up for the third candidate. Or if somebody gets 25% of the vote, they can be a spoiler. So Maine is a good place for ranked choice voting. The reason I'm going off about it is that there's all kinds of reforms, and one needs to study the political culture of a state to figure out whether the reform is going to work. And so, you know, we're just starting to get into that. I think ranked choice voting is a really good experiment that can be tried, and they're trying it in Maine. They're going to try it in Massachusetts, it looks like, if that initiative passes. So there's
have you heard in New Jersey? I thought I'd heard Assemblyman Zwicker had introduced something to that effect.
Oh yeah?
Oh, okay. That's what I had.
I think it's entirely possible that he would have done that.
Got it. Okay, but I take it that it has not really moved in the legislature.
The difficulty with a lot of these reforms is that they go against the interests of the existing parties. And so ranked choice voting is a reform that tends to give some oxygen to minor parties. And it's really hard to get people who are members of the major parties to go along. And so the best way for that to work is in states that allow a citizen initiative. So in Maine, there was a citizen initiative that amended that created a law that implemented ranked choice voting. So I think it's sometimes tough to get. It's really hard to get legislators to think that far ahead. And it's just a challenge.
I wanted to go to one of the questions I think Melissa had asked earlier about, you know, how to incentivize people to vote. It was actually one of our closing questions, but I want it, since it kind of ties into this, everybody knows the person who's passionate about politics, loves to argue, etc. But if you were to investigate their voting record, they are either not registered to vote or they don't vote. How do you reconcile that difference? And then is there research in neuroscience to kind of explain that?
I really understand the question. So the idea is like people who aren't motivated to vote?
Well, no, they're very passionate about politics. They're watching the news, they're watching CNN, they love to debate with you. But if you were to actually pull up their voting record, they didn't vote. So like they're really engaged, but they don't, and so it's like a disconnect. It's like almost cognitive dissonance. Right. So is that?
Right. So there's a behavioral intervention that works. It's been demonstrated that if you mail people, like at least in one study, you mail people a postcard, and the postcard says, these members of your community voted last time. After the election, I'm going to send you another postcard, and it's either going to have you on it or not, because it's a public record whether you voted. And that intervention actually increases the likelihood of voting. Now, it's sort of creepy, because who the heck wants to have your, but it turns out it's a public record whether you vote. So one answer is that. Another answer is, that actually is an intervention that works, like basically social pressure. One of the difficulties with voting is that voting is just one of many things we have to do. We got to pick up the kids at daycare, take the car to go get fixed. If you're a student, you got a problem set due. There's all kinds of things you got to do in real life. And one of the difficulties with voting is that it doesn't bring you an immediate material benefit. And furthermore, it's not even clear how much it changes your life because, honestly, mathematically, one vote mathematically doesn't make very much difference. So at some level, the difficulty is in creating a civic culture where I would characterize voting as like praying. If you're religious, praying doesn't make the deity that you worship better. Your deity is actually great without you. But praying makes you better. And, voting is an important part of our democracy, but it is also a thing that makes you better. And so getting people to believe that voting makes them better probably requires social pressure, probably requires behavioral interventions. And it is a hard challenge to get people to vote. I completely agree that this is one of the central challenges in our democracy where we can't force them to.
Do you want to go back to the questions, or I would love to ask this question.
Yeah, go for it.
That's on the Q&A. So which results in greater underrepresentation, voter intimidation or gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering. It turns out that, look, the right to vote is precious, and we should, I think as an ideal, make sure that as many people vote as are qualified to do so. But it is possible for a 50-50 vote in the state of Pennsylvania to lead to a 12-6 delegation favoring Democrats, or a 13-5 delegation favoring Republicans, or a 9-9 delegation. And so we are talking about a swing of, in the vicinity of 5 or 6 congressional seats that are under the control not of any voters, but of whoever held the pen to draw the districts. And so this is why I get so agitated and get my hair on fire over redistricting. It's this secret passkey to manipulate democracy. So having the right to vote, all the people who bled and fought and passed laws and went to court to protect the right to vote, all of that is for nothing if somebody else drew the lines to keep you from having your full share of power. And so, the answer is both are important, right? We fought for the right to vote in the 1960s and 70s. We're still fighting for the right to vote. And we should also fight for fair representation. And it's like learning to imagine if you studied really hard to be a driver and you wanted to become a driver and you wanted to operate a motor vehicle, and then the DMV is only open like between 4 and 5 in the morning on Thursdays, okay? That's what gerrymandering is like. And so there are limits to what our democracy can achieve unless we attend to every aspect of it, including redistricting.
And so, Jean, I'll take the question that had to do with that, which is, I think it's a two-part question, what impact do you think the shortened census period will have on legislative districts, and what impact will it have? Well, I guess you asked about the funding, but so I guess we're still questioning what the census taking and results, how that's going to be affected by COVID and the shortened period.
Yeah, the census is a tough situation because the counting period has been shortened both by the pandemic and also by moves by the Trump administration to terminate the count earlier than people who have been paying attention to the technical details would have recommended. So right now the census, I believe, has been ordered by several federal judges to go through October 31st, which is a 1-month extension. So that's a blessing. The count is really important for things like housing supports and other payments that get made to the states. And so that's one reason why the count is really important. The count is also important for purposes of redistricting and drawing the lines. To some extent, the Census Bureau is at work doing statistical corrections to try to fix that so that there can be corrections made. And I think one of the open questions between now and next spring, when the numbers are supposed to be coming out, is exactly how to repair the damage that's been done to the census. And so that's an open question. And I would say people at the Commerce Department, look, that's an agency that is full of mathematically inclined people who are thinking of all kinds of ways to fix these problems. And so they have an enormous task in front of them. It is going to have some effect on representation. And I would say it's an effect that is, kind of in the same category as voter suppression, an effect that we would very much like to not have happen. And then the jet fuel to make all these things worse, or the gasoline to pour on the fire, is the redistricting, where if you undercount a community, then you can draw a bigger line around them so that they're a smaller fraction of a district and they have less impact on representation, right? Like that's the way a failed census could mess up a community. And so it's a big technical challenge. And I think if we get a new presidential administration, I think that's going to be an important issue in the coming year.
Do you know if the census in 1920 was affected by the pandemic in terms of collecting data back then?
My recollection is that was a pretty tough year for a census, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't remember that. A book that I would really encourage people to read is, what's that great book about the pandemic? Wow, I'm drawing a blank. It's this really amazing history of the pandemic. And I apologize for not remembering it. But there is a very good book about it. I would have to refer to that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the answer.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that whole situation affected voting districts back then.
There were other problems back then. So I will say that the age of one person, one vote, where districts have to be of equal population, that really only started in the 1970s with a series of Supreme Court cases that mandated what is now called the one man, one vote, or one person, one vote principle. So back then there were Jim Crow laws that held down Black people. An example of how people are held down is that I think in Tennessee, I believe, all the members of Congress of Tennessee were elected from a single at-large district where whoever won the majority vote named every member of Congress from the state of Tennessee. And so that was a bigger problem than a census at that time. So there are some pretty major problems, and it's really not until the civil rights era in the 60s and 70s that we started getting something more resembling what we would think of as intuitively fair representation.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
So if I can, there's a question in the chat from a young person, and this person says, aside from fulfilling my civic duties, how can a young person with data science and engineering experience apply their technical skills to this problem?
Come work for the Electoral Innovation Lab. We're hiring, although we can hire some people. So I think the answer is that there are organizations around the country that are doing this kind of work. I think that someone with data science skills could work for a number of organizations that do social good. The Brennan Center for Justice comes to mind. On the Democratic Party side, there's the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. There's the ACLU, there's the League of Women Voters, they're nonpartisan. There's an organization called Data for Progress. So I think there are a lot of ways that, that a person can get involved. And we are a part of that wave of people, and we're attempting to do some good. My students who created the representable.org website are an example of that. And while we're talking, somebody asked me to put in some web links, so I'm going to put in some web links into the chat. Keep on going. I can listen to type.
There was another question about how much money do you think it would take to get those 6 states to be split control? How much money do we have to donate?
Amazingly little. Okay, I got to say, this is just this incredible, crazy bargain. So state legislative races in Kansas are decided by just a few hundred votes. A few thousand people vote per district. State legislatures are larger than congressional delegations, right? So the Texas state legislature has 120 members or 150, I think. And its congressional delegation is like less than a third that size. And so these races are smaller. We estimated, we sat down and figured out how many votes it would take to bring about bipartisanship in the 6 states that I mentioned. And our estimate is between 100,000 and 150,000 votes would be enough to bring, well-placed votes would be enough to bring about bipartisanship in the drawing of 93 districts. That's 1/5 of Congress that could get fairer districting with just the movement of 150,000 votes. And as far as I can tell, just a few $1,000s placed gets you a long way. As I said before, I have, if you go over to election.princeton.edu, there are resources for both Republicans and Democrats, and for aggregating resources. And I got to say, the amounts of money, if I compare them with campaign disclosures of these candidates in these various states, it really doesn't take much. It is a very different story than giving to a Senate campaign or to a presidential campaign. The amounts are like 1/100th as much. So individual donors of normal means can make a pretty big difference.
And have you been asked by any states to help them with redistricting?
We do work with governments. We've worked with reform organizations. An example is Voters Not Politicians, which is the Michigan organization that brought about the redistricting commission there. We do work with state governments. An example is that Michigan now has a commission process, and they have to train all the commissioners. And we've been in conversation with them about setting up their training. And so that's a situation in which we are trying to be as helpful as we can. We're creating a whole database of precinct voting data to help people score plans and find out how fair they are. And our website is called openprecincts.org. And so openprecincts.org is one of our projects. So we help these organizations, and we do so. We're funded by foundation grants. We're also funded by individual donations. And so, you know, that's what powers us, and we do work with governments.
That's great. Melissa, did you want to, let me just see.
There are a lot of questions over here. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. If you want to take a stab at some of them, Sam.
And by the way, it is correct. One person said The Great Influenza. She is correct. That's the book. It's an amazing book, The Great Influenza. I really encourage people to
look. There was another question in the Q&A
that
isn't voter turnout the biggest wild card in the ultimate accuracy of polls? What's your opinion on that?
Yes, it is. It's not the greatest wild card, but it certainly is a challenge. I mean, there are a lot of technical challenges to polling. I would disagree with that statement. I would say more broadly that it is difficult to get a good sample, and people who work in public opinion have to address all of them. And there is such a thing as having a high turnout model or a low turnout model. I think it's safe to say that turnout this year is going to be very high. And so, but there is some question about, you know, well, okay, what about mail-in voting and so on? I think that one thing that can be done, I think that one thing that you can do is assume that any poll is going to be off in either direction by a few points. And if you assume that, then rather than treat the poll as a thing that you consume passively like a sports fan, think of democracy as a sport where you can look at the scoreboard and then run down onto the field and do something. And so what I would say is that if you feel that, if you have any doubts about polls, take that doubt and go do something. Help volunteer at the polls to help people cast their vote, help be a poll watcher, you know, like see what's happening over at the Lawyers Committee or at the ACLU or at Common Cause. I think that there are a lot of things that citizens can do to help the election go off in an orderly manner. And I would encourage people to do everything they can legally to come up with a fair election in which everybody gets to vote, whether they agree with you politically or not. Everyone should vote, and you should not be thinking about people who agree or disagree with you. It is in all our interest for there to be an orderly election.
And so one of the questions is from someone who is going to work in the polls, wants to know exactly what they should be looking for and what should they be concerned about when they are there.
Well, if you're a poll worker, you have training, and I don't want to get in the way of that training. I will now make a deep, dark confession, which is that I have never volunteered on election day. I'm the nerd in the control booth adding up numbers. Like I'm not like on the field, like, you know, like doing all that stuff. There are laws that govern the conduct of elections, and I believe that at Georgetown Law School, the law students there have come up with a clinic where they've come up with a guide for all the things to watch out for. And I'm going to see if I can pull it out while we're talking. But things like there can't be campaign literature distributed within 75 feet of a polling site. That's just an example of, let's see, let me see if I can find it. Shoot. Anyway, at somewhere in the, here we go. I'm going to drop this in the chat. Georgetown Law School has, okay, it's a CNN article. While we're doing this, I'm going to try to find that thing. Here we go. Law.georgetown.edu. No, I don't want that. Let's see. So I just dropped a couple of things into the chat. And so there's fact sheets for every one of the 50 states, and they describe what you can do and what you should look out for. Things like you can't politic, you can't wear like political garb when you're near the polls. Militias are not allowed. It is not legal to have a weapon at any polling station anywhere in America. And so you got to report that. And there's a number that you can report to report that kind of problem. And specifically, let me just see, let me just pull up the phone number, because if you observe any jiggery pokery at a polling station, then the number to call is 866-OUR-VOTE. Here it is, 866-OUR-VOTE. And so if you see some funny business going on, that's the number to call. And that's an organization called Election Protection, 866-OUR-VOTE.
So it's about 8:30, and should we take one more question, Jean?
Sure. I'll be briefer than I have been.
Yeah.
Did you want to do the one, the future?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so what is the anticipated, I guess it's the, what do you see as the trajectory of change in 20 years out?
Yeah, I saw a question that was pre-submitted, and this links to that, where someone asked whether I was an optimist or a pessimist. And I would say that we are at a low point. This is a really tough time for our democracy. And I suppose we could find out that it could go lower, which I hope it doesn't. But I am quite confident, optimistic that there are better times ahead. The first Gilded Age led to the progressive era. That included things like senators being elected by popular vote, women getting the right to vote. And then after a long delay, we eventually finally started to keep the promise of civil rights for African Americans. So I think that there is a possibility of things getting much better and more representative. And if we can get through this period of bitter partisanship and breakdown in our democracy, I think those broken pieces can create something better. I would say 5 to 10 years from now. But I'm going to be honest and say that the next 5 years are going to be actually reasonably challenging. I think there are ways that we can reform the system, whether it be changes in voting rules, reforming the courts, addressing gerrymandering, coming up with uniform protection of voting rights nationwide for all racial groups and all marginalized groups. So I think that there's a lot of good that can happen. The difficulty is that we are in this time when we're polarized by race, by party, by economic division, and we have climate change. And all of these are, huge challenges of our time. I think demographics are moving towards a better situation. And our challenge is to A, build a better future 5 to 10 years from now, and B, do what we can to not erode our institutions between now and then. And so there's a lot of protection of our governmental system that we have to engage in now. And I would encourage everyone, no matter how ordinary you think you may be, to step up and do much more than the ordinary.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to thank you, Professor Wang, for all that you're doing and for your talk tonight. And I'd like to thank Jason, who's on the screen behind the scenes, who we couldn't have done this without him, and helped with this evening's presentation. And a thank you to Soraya Francisco at AlumniCorps. And again, thank Rick Ober and Tom Swift to Princeton Area Alumni Association, and Nancy Lin and Doug Chin of the Asian American Alumni Association of Princeton, and Ron Wolk of the Princeton Association, New York City, for co-sponsoring tonight's webinar, and to Jean, my co-chair. And really, thank you. And for those folks who are out there, please make sure you vote and volunteer to vote, work at polls. And remember, the debate is in about a half an hour. Stay safe, healthy, and pull a lever if you can. Fill out your ballots. Any last words, Jean?
Just thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wang, and Melissa, my wonderful co-chair. We had a lot of fun prepping for this, back and forth, texts, emails, and so forth. So thank you and good night. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.